Welcome to this video where I'll cover some of the slightly offbeat variations that white can choose against the Caro-Kann defense for black. So c6 after king's pawn to e4, and then we will not cover the move d4 in this video, which is the main line. We will cover that in a separate section. But we will cover everything else that white can do after c6. I'll start with the move knight c3, d5 as always from black, and then of course I will check out the two knights variation, but I will start with a slightly annoying and offbeat move, namely queen to f3. This move is slightly peculiar, and it's a very typical blitz move. Of course, the point for white is that after d4, of course harassing this knight, and bishop c4 is a very tricky move indeed. However, we do not have to take the knight on c3 and allow white to wreak havoc on the king side. We can play the calm e6. And even though this looks like a huge success for white, knight e2, d3, queen going to g3 and f4 coming, this is not the end of the world for black, because c5 and this sequence of moves is actually quite fine for black. There are no weaknesses in the black camp. Bishop to d6 will come after maybe g6, or maybe just fianchettoing the bishop will do fine as well. But now, slightly depending on white's next move, black can have the chance to seize the initiative. For example, after the move f4, which is very logical, getting the knight to f3, black has a very strong move, b5, getting the initiative on the queen side, because, as you may see, bishop takes, runs into queen a5 with a deadly check, winning the bishop as well. So this does not work very well for white. This will allow black a very nice initiative on the queen side, so many have tried a4 instead, starting with a4 to limit black's chances on the queen side. a3 might be better because of the move we'll play with black now, namely knight b4. Using this b4 square that's available to us and hitting the pawn on c2, basically forcing king to d1, because bishop to b3 is of course a move, but could run into something like c4 followed by d3, which could be quite annoying for white. So king to d1 is actually the computer recommendation, but this cannot be a big worry for black, who enjoys a stable and sound position, and white of course could have the opportunity to drum up something on the king side with f4, but so far so good for black. So after the move queen to f3, d4 is of course playable. You could also just take on e4 and play knight f6, and this should also be quite fine. So the point of queen f3, namely getting this bishop to c4 in, is in fact not so efficient. So this variation is not dangerous for us. But it is of course a nice variation to try with white in blitz, and I'm not sure many knows this variation with black. I don't think it's so popular, at least not in classical chess. Could be more popular in blitz, so check it out if you'd like. Of course, I will check out knight f3 now, going into the full-blown two knights against the Caro-Kann. Many variations available to us here. We can start with the most obvious one, namely de4. Just remember, guys, that d4 is not so efficient in this variation. It's not very effective because the knight goes on round to g3, and the bishop will go to either b5 or c4, and white will get a very fluid and very easy position to play. So for example, something like this, e5, castles, bishop e6 has been played, which looks very ugly. Something like bishop d6 could also be played, but suddenly we have, of course, d3 is possible, preparing f4 in some lines, but also the immediate knight to h5 could create problems for black on the king side. So watch out for this variation, guys. It's not exactly winning for white, but it's definitely more pleasant, I think. So de4 is a variation available to us, and then knight f6, for example. Many variations still possible. Bishop f5 could have been played. maybe, but also just a calm knight d7 is a move. Knight f6 takes is the critical, if you can call this variation critical at all. G takes or ef is are our two options, both playable but very different in style. So Magnus Carlsen has had this position with the black pieces, and many other great players like Caro-Kann has played this with black. GF is a favorite of Caro-Kann, which is quite playable, and we can follow some high-level games here. This is Michael Adams against Nigel Short from 2011, a fine win for white, but not due to the opening. So bishop e2 is very playable, e6, and then something like this. It's not uncommon to see from the black side of things, and knight d7, and maybe even long castles to be able to drum up some play on the king side, because it's not by coincidence that you chose to play GF. It's to get something going on the king side, utilize this open G file, and create problems for white quite early on. So this is very unbalanced stuff. But in this position, this exact position is good for white because c5 forces the bishop back. Of course, you don't want to trade off these two bishops, because this will leave black with a hole on d6, which he will struggle to fill. And of course, if a knight ever gets into d6, or maybe even another piece, this could be very, very ugly for black. So don't do this. Bishop e7 is slightly better, but in this position white has 3 or maybe even more good moves, but b4 is good. And of course h3 is very nice as well. Maybe even knight h4 to trade off the bishops is also an efficient way to secure the advantage for white, but my preference would probably be b4 in this position. Okay, so this is of course very nice to see that GF is playable, and it's been employed by many high-level players, but EF is the popular way to go these days. It's also a pretty popular line in the main line of the Caro-Kann, which we will look at in a separate video. This has been played in this exact position by Magnus Carlsen, by Nepomniachtchi, by Nakamura, so it's a real sample of quality and approval there. And this kind of pawn structure has been quite popular for some time now, because it's very solid for black, but it also leaves enough room for creative ideas and grabbing the initiative for black. So it's not really a drawing weapon, so to speak. It's actually not without venom. It's quite nice to see top level players play this with black, because it means unbalanced and an interesting play from the get-go. So bishop d6, bishop e2, many options for black here. I would just suggest castling as fast as possible in general. So castles, and then for example c4 from white. Now something like bishop f5 is fine, but also just knight d7 and following this standard maneuver is quite common. And as we can see, queen to d2, knight to g6, the knight completes its round to a more active posting on g6, and black's chances are approximately equal in this position, even though there's plenty of imbalance here. Just remember that due to this double pawn, you don't want to trade off every single piece in this position with black, because the pawn and king endgame, or king and pawn endgame as it's called, would very often be lost for black, because this double pawn is not so easy to utilize in the endgame. It needs to be supported by pieces. So don't trade off too many pieces in this variation, guys. It will be difficult to defend. Okay, so this was the two knights. Of course, there are other variations to play with black here as well, namely bishop g4. I will not go into depth on this one. It's very solid, and it's been played by Magnus Carlsen, this line as well. So it's not bad by any means. It's just more theoretical than the other lines. So please check it out. White usually plays h3, black takes on f3 actually, and plays e6. Trades off the problematic bishop on c8 and creates a pawn structure based on white squares to be able to employ this bishop as efficiently as possible in the center to beat bishop to d6, for example. So this is black's strategy. White can do lots of different things. Very often it's connected to this d3 move, bishop d2, and then long castles. This is actually quite popular and it's been played by many great players, including Morozevich. Interesting position. Feel free to check this one out for yourself. I will check out another line here, which is the King's Indian attack, which is a variation that you can play against almost any opening, including the Caro-Kann. So we will go d5 with black anyway. Knight d2, e5 is my recommendation. This is the easiest way to get a playable and probably quite equal position with black. Many options as usual in the opening. Not everyone are as good, but g6 is fine. Fianchettoing the bishop is just perfectly playable. I will not go into depth on this, but also queen c7 is possible to control squares in the center and just to prepare e5. But e5 is the easiest move. Knight f3, bishop d6, and now white has 3 options: d4, g3, and of course bishop e2. Bishop e2 I will not analyze in this video. You can of course find a study on Lichess if you follow my username, which should be in the information field on the video, but this is not a move that should worry you much. I mean, the bishop is not doing much on e2, it's just to develop with black and you should be doing fine. d4, however, is more critical to analyze because this puts maximum amount of pressure on the black center. So the most obvious move is taking on e4. Would not recommend this because knight takes e4 creates a big initiative for white. I mean, the bishop is threatened, the pawn is under attack, and if you take on d4, then for example queen takes d4 is very good for black, for white, sorry, already threatening the bishop, threatening a pawn on g7, and of course the only non-losing move here is, I think, is bishop f8, but as you can see, white's so far ahead in development that this should be practically losing for black. So don't do this with black. It would create unnecessary problems. It's better to take on d4. White flicks in ed5, so we are left with an isolated queen's pawn on d5. This is not the end of the world though for black, even though this might be well, not to everyone's taste. It's a position that is evaluated as equal. You could play knight e7 here, would create a different kind of dynamic in the center, would create some other options for you, but knight f6 is more active as the knight can go to e4, so I would recommend this. Bishop d3 could go to e2 as well. Castles, rook e8, maybe c3 from white. Black will follow with knight e4, maybe the bishop to g4. And the game is on. Black is left with an isolated queen's pawn, so you don't want to trade off too many pieces because the less pieces there are on the board, the easier it is to mount and build pressure against the pawn on d5. So to shift white's focus from adding pressure on your isolated pawn, keep pieces on the board and try to play active chess. And of course white wants to control the square in front of the isolated pawn, maybe trade off some pieces, and of course create pressure against this isolated guy in the center. Okay, this is not so dangerous though, so that's good to know because d4 is very direct. g3 is another option, going for a full-blown King's Indian attack style with the fianchettoed bishop. But after these moves, and then for example rook e8, which is useful, could transfer your knight to g6, always possible. Many options are available here for white. 3 I would like to highlight. These 3 moves: b3, fianchettoing the bishop, rook e1, and breaking in the center with d4, all needs to be they all need to be considered by black. I can just highlight or underscore the fact that black is doing fine in this position. So check out white's alternatives. There's plenty of life left in the position, plenty of play to check out in this variation, but from an objective point of view, black should not be too worried. This is not the most testing, theoretically at least, but in practical terms, this can be a very efficient weapon for the right player. So check this one out if you'd like. And of course, there are other options to review and to analyze. There's one particular variation I would just like to highlight, and that is knight e2, which is an old favorite of one of my favorite players, actually, Grandmaster Rune Djurhuus from Norway, former European champion, junior champion, beating Vladimir Kramnik along the way. He's a very cool grandmaster, always lots of fresh ideas, and knight e2 is a pet line of his, which is not without venom, of course. If you're familiar with Rune Djurhuus's games, you know that he's not much for quick draws. He likes to play fighting chess, and this is definitely a fighting move. Knight e2, the point is e5, and after c5, d4, and there is no pin on g4 because f3 would be an efficient blocker of that bishop. So that's not available for black, this resource, the pin. Of course, you could take on d4, the knight will take, and suddenly we have a variation we know from the advanced variation in the Caro-Kann. This is known to be at least slightly testing for black after the aggressive move c4, e6, and I will just show you the main line. Many options here, including bishop c5 or knight e7. I will review bishop b4 very shortly. And after it takes on c6, queen a4, and of course you could play a5 here, which is the normal move. Of course, queen takes c6 is met with the efficient bishop d7, and after queen b7, yeah, the queen is alive for now, but after a move like knight e7, you have to wonder for how long Her Majesty will be with us on b7. So this is slightly too greedy, I would say. So a5, just protecting the bishop, maybe getting the bishop to a6 at some later point in the game. cd is the best move, queen d5. And now a very cool sequence of moves. Take on b4, which looks like a huge blunder, but of course it liberates the knight to take on d5. ed5, bishop e3, and in this position, black has two moves to secure at least approximately equal play, f6 and bishop f5. But of course, there's plenty of imbalance in this position. White has the bishop pair, which is always a small advantage, but black enjoys an open a-file against or towards the pawn on a2, which definitely feels the pressure, and also easy development for black and potentially an active king in the endgame. So lots of pros and cons for both players in this variation, but it's cool to see novel ideas from time to time. Of course, after e5, c5 is a move to consider. Also, bishop f5 is possible. Knight g3 is the point for white. There are other moves as well possible here, but knight g3 is the obvious move, and then h4. You could play h6, which is definitely playable, and this kind of position looks okay, but white has e6, which could be very annoying, this pawn sacrifice. And after d4, of course, it's not easy to get this pawn back for white, but white will enjoy long-term compensation as long as he can control this e5 square and thus limit black from liberating himself with the e6, e5. And of course, bishop d3 will really make black feel the lack of his bishop on h7 after it's exchanged off on d3, because it protects the important square g6, which could be very annoying for black indeed here. So avoid h6 actually, which is an autopilot move. Play h5. You don't have to worry about this pawn getting lost in any way, because in this position, if you take it with, for example, the bishop, we will regain the pawn immediately, so there's no big worry there. And of course, if knight takes, you could take the knight on h5 and win the pawn back in the same way, of course. You could also just play for a central game here with c5, knight c6 coming, and you have a major compensation for the pawn. And of course, remember that this knight can't really move, because if it moves, goes back, then the h pawn will be lost. And if you go to f4, we just move the bishop to f5. You could even, of course, consider taking on h4, but just moving this bishop is the easiest. And after these moves, rook h4 is practically winning for black, so f3 is a blunder. So you could, of course, catch out some greedy white players in this variation. Cool to see, cool variation. White should consider d4, getting some play in the center in this variation, at least at some point, maybe now or even earlier after h4, h5. This could be considered. So e6, also another idea for white. Always be on the lookout for this idea in this position. It's very, very dangerous. Of course, it's not winning by any means. You will take it and you will have a pawn up, but it's definitely not without poison, this idea, and this long-term pawn sacrifice. So that's at least some ideas for both black and for white in the Caro-Kann, in these offbeat lines. Without d4, I will review lines in the main lines in another video. I hope this was a good introduction to some offbeat lines you can try out against the Caro-Kann. If you don't want to learn too much theory, this is a very good start. And for you that play the Caro-Kann with the black pieces, this should be a pretty efficient recipe for countering some of these slightly offbeat variations. So good luck in your games, and I'll see you in the next video on the main lines.